Hiya! Welcome! This is part 3 of my little series about how to watch professional wrestling if you're a newbie or a lapsed fan, particularly aimed towards people who want to watch wrestling in the United Kingdom and Ireland, but this applies to Europe, Asia, Africa, North America, all around the world. And I have to thank everybody who has given me such positive feedback for my last 2 videos on this subject. The responses that I've had have been fantastic. It really makes me feel good that I can pass on my knowledge, which isn't extravagantly good, but I have watched wrestling for many years and I know quite a lot about the business as being a long-time fan, and I've also done a little bit of filming and editing work in local British wrestling over the years as well. People were asking me for a part 3, and here it is. One thing that I will address is something that, although no one's really asked me about it as such, I figured that there might be some questions or some queries from people who are signing up to the WWE network or just starting to watch wrestling once again and maybe have got confused by what's going on here in 2019. And what I mean by that is, when I first started watching WWF in 1990, 1991, and then started watching WCW a couple of years later, around 1993, in the WWF at that point, there was really only 3 championships. There was the World Wrestling Federation Championship, now known as the WWE Championship. There was the Intercontinental title, and there was the World Tag Team titles. There was a Women's Championship, technically, in the early 90s. I think it had been deactivated, I think possibly sometime in the late 80s though, and it wasn't really reactivated until a few years later, during the Alundra Blaze era. Whereas any lapsed fan in particular who is used to just there being 3 belts, 4 belts really, because the tag team championship is always 2. Any lapsed fan watching now will soon come to realise, particularly if they're watching as much of the current WWE product as they can, that there are 18 championships currently active in the WWE right now. 18. I won't list each one, but there's a graphic on the screen there that shows you all the current champions of all 18 titles in WWE. And the reason that there is so many now, I mean there's a few reasons really, but the main reason is that WWE is split into brands and has been on and off since 2002. Vince McMahon and the World Wrestling Federation, they purchased the rights and trademarks to World Championship Wrestling, WCW, back in March 2001. So they basically absorbed the one other major league wrestling company when they bought all their assets. And really since then, up until very, very recently, WWE hasn't really had any major league competition in the wrestling business. All Elite Wrestling looks to be great competition, but it's still a very new organisation and it's too early to say how that's going to go, that particular rivalry. But to cut a long story short, WWE has been the only game in town for the best part of 20 years. So with a big roster of wrestlers, bigger than ever, the only way to really create competition for Vince McMahon was to split the brands, and initially he did this in 2002 when Raw and SmackDown became separate brands, and that lasted for quite a number of years. It was kind of starting to be phased out towards the latter part of the last decade, and then in more recent years they decided to restart the brand extension, as they called it. So we had Raw with all its championships, we have SmackDown with all its championships, And now we have brands like NXT, which has 4 championships on that brand, and NXT UK, which has 3 championships on that brand. So when you add them all together, it is a lot of titles, and it's kind of overwhelming, but generally most of these championships, with a few exceptions, are specific to that particular WWE brand. You're unlikely to see the Universal Championship, which is essentially the Monday Night Raw World title, being defended on a SmackDown show. Other titles, such as the 24/7 Championship and the Women's Tag Team Championships, they're not brand exclusive, and they theoretically can be defended across Raw, SmackDown, NXT and NXT UK. Although it's entertainment, it's like a soap opera really. The sporting element means there has to be like an ultimate prize to go for, and a lot of people find that all these titles being defended in essentially the one company is overkill, and I do agree with that to an extent, but it is what it is. That is the era that we're living in now. Right, I just want to answer a couple of questions that I was asked by the Geeky Heathen. Thank you, Glenn, for your really wonderful feedback to my last couple of videos. I know you're enjoying this series, and you were the impetus for me to start making these videos. I've also had great feedback from other friends and supporters of mine, such as the Pop-Tart, Big Inzy, who was signed up to the WWE Network and watched a couple of my documentary recommendations from part 2 already. Fantastic stuff, Rickles, brilliant mate. But here's a couple of questions from the Geeky Heathen, and he wants to know, does wrestling have seasons? The short answer is no. There's no off-season in wrestling. In fact, I remember a period in the early to mid-90s, I think it was when there was a Major League Baseball strike actually. One of the WWF's big ad campaigns or promotional campaigns was, we're not like baseball or the other sports, we don't have an off-season. You could technically say that when it gets to WrestleMania season, which is always around early April or occasionally late March, that once WrestleMania's over and done with, it's kind of like the start of the new year for WWE, as kind of a lot of storylines reset and get resolved and new things start happening quite often after WrestleMania. But there's no off season where there's a period of weeks or a month or a couple of months where there's absolutely no programming going on. It's just something that happens all year round, 52 weeks a year really. I have seen, pundits and fans talk about the fact that maybe there should be an off season at some point in the year for wrestling, simply to give all these superstars that are working 52 weeks a year, give them a proper holiday and allow them the opportunity to heal from minor injuries a bit quicker by not having to be out on the road and to spend time with their families, etc. But I can't see that happening in my lifetime. It would have a big knock-on effect if there was no new wrestling on television or even the WWE Network for even a month. WWE's ad revenues would suffer so much. They rely so much on sponsorships and advertising these days. What would there be no traditional pay-per-view market anymore either? Geeky Heathen also asked me, how are the champions selected? Does everyone have to fight each other and people get eliminated until only the top 2? Is it more like UFC? The concept of a number 1 contender, as in you've got your champion at the top and then number 1 below him is the next guy who's going to wrestle that champion for the belt. That sort of thing, it does happen, but really challengers for belts, for titles, are chosen at the booker's whim. A booker, by the way, for those who don't know, would be the guy or lady who writes the show. In WWE's case, it is almost always Vince McMahon who has the final say. It doesn't really depend on any legitimate sporting accolades or wins and losses. it depends on the booker's whim and sometimes how much a wrestler is getting over with the crowd. Getting over with a crowd, with an audience, means they're getting the desired and amplified enough reaction. So if you're a good guy, a babyface, you're getting cheered a lot. If you're a heel, a bad guy, you're getting booed a lot. So there's those factors, and also there's other factors which I won't go into grave detail over, like who manages to sell the most merchandise. You know, that's how John Cena stayed on top for so many years, even though a lot of hardcore fans didn't particularly like him for a long time. He was massively popular with children, and those children's parents were spending a lot of money on John Cena t-shirts. So John Cena remained at the top of the card and as a babyface throughout the majority of his WWE career. We do see number one contendership matches, battle royals, and tournaments to determine challengers for titles. But there again, it's the people running the show who decide who wins and loses, and really it's up to them because it's not a sport. So yeah, thank you for those questions, Glenn, and thank you everybody for watching this. I'm still happy to field any questions that people might have, and I can put them in a future video, but really appreciate once again the great feedback I've had for this series. I love to talk about wrestling, so this really is a natural fit for me, and people asked for a part 3 like they did for a part 2, so I was perfectly happy to do this. Much love to all of you who have really got behind this How to Watch Wrestling in the UK series. I'm now going to go and probably watch some wrestling actually. It's a big week in professional wrestling. AEW Dynamite premiered on television this week. NXT head-to-head with AEW Dynamite. The Wednesday Night Wars, like I said in part 2. If you want to see an epic documentary about two companies battling it out, watch the 20-part series, The Monday Night Wars. That's fantastic. But I am going to go now, and I do hope that you all join me for my next video, be it wrestling related or whatever it may be. Cheers everyone. See ya!